just a second to get set up here. All right, can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Well, I'm impressed with the crowd that showed up. When I agreed to do this, I've done presentations before on the history of Riverside. When I agreed to do this, I expected maybe to get 40 or 50 people. I didn't expect an entire full house here. So I'm impressed with the interest in this. Let me ask you a couple of questions just to get an idea of who we have in the audience. How many folks here grew up in Riverside, their parents grew up in Riverside, have some connection to Riverside? Okay, cool. All right. How many people here are natives of New Bern? How many are natives of North Carolina? Okay. So we have quite a mix here. Now I've done lots of research on Riverside. I've collected information from all over the place, different sources as well as individuals, and I'm trying as much as possible to check the facts and try to be as accurate as I can about what I'm going to say. For example, let me give you an example of a piece of information that I was given by our own Dallas Blackiston. When I first moved to Riverside, I was talking with Dallas about all the Union troops that camped in the area during the Civil War. And Dallas told me, he said, well, you know why all the troops wanted to be in Riverside? It's so they could be close to the ice cream at Mayola Dairy. So I've kind of checked that fact, and that's not really the case. I've also heard the comment, this was from a former New Bern elected official. I was talking with them about, the wonderful houses that we have in, historic houses that we have in Riverside as well as Ghent. And their comment was, those aren't historic houses. It's got to be houses from the 1700s and 1800s. That's historic. Ghent and Riverside really don't have any historic houses. I disagree with that. We have a complete, basically a complete set of houses that were built between the late 1800s through the 1920s, a great snapshot of historic architecture from that period. And one of the things that I tell people that own these old houses, whether it's downtown, whether it's Riverside, whether it's Ghent, whether it's de Graaf and Reed, is that you don't just own an old house. You're a steward of a piece of history of New Bern. And I think that's real important for people to understand. I mean, we are trying to preserve these houses for the future, not just for our own enjoyment. Another thing that I think of when you're talking about some of the houses in Riverside, Riverside was more of a working class neighborhood. And I think about what Kay Williams would say about telling the history of New Bern. She said, we need to tell all the stories, not just the pretty ones. So I think that's one of the things that I'm really focusing on with what I'm trying to do with Riverside, is not just collect the stories about the rich and famous who lived in Riverside, but the typical folks who worked at the lumber mills, who worked at the train depot. It's important that we know what they did, how they lived, a little bit of the history of who actually lived in Riverside. Now, as far as Riverside is concerned, there really wasn't a whole lot out in the Riverside area until probably the late 1800s. This is a map from, I think, 1817 of the New Bern area. And if you look at this area up here, this is what is now Riverside. It's pretty much farms and open fields. If we move to 1864, this is a map that was done by the Union troops, and this is the Riverside area here. And this is the defensive line of the Union troops. 3 of the 4 forts that the Union Army built They were in Riverside. We have Fort Dutton, which is just north of the Mayola property where they park their trucks. We have Fort Stevenson, which is down towards the end of River Drive, almost to Jack Smith Creek. And then we have Fort Rowan, that is roughly where Greenfield Cemetery is. That was a fairly large earthen fort that they built to protect the railroad line. That would have been the easiest way to get into New Bern by land because the roads were so bad at that point. Now a little bit on the Union troops. This is a very rough overlay of where the Union troops were located in the Riverside area. You have the Massachusetts 46th, Massachusetts 44th, I think it's the Massachusetts 24th. You had the 10th Connecticut here. So you had a lot of the troops in the Riverside area. I've actually done landscaping and dug up bullets in my driveway as I was doing some landscaping. Kathy Vitals, who lives on National Avenue, told me that when she was doing some landscaping several years ago, she dug up a cannonball and she didn't know what to do with it, so she sold it on eBay. So who knows what's buried in Riverside as far as the Union troops are concerned. Now there's one interesting story. How many have heard of the capture of the USS Underwriter? Few people. This is roughly where the USS Underwriter was captured and destroyed. And it's quite an interesting story. It was in February of 1864. The number of Union troops had been pulled down in New Bern because Grant was determined to capture Richmond in 1864. So a lot of the troops had left to go up to the Richmond area to fight up there. This is the prime opportunity for the Confederates to try to capture New Bern. New Bern had a lot of supplies that the Confederate Army desperately needed. George Pickett was supposed to lead the land assault on New Bern, and they also engaged this gentleman, John Taylor Wood. He was notorious for being able to capture naval vessels up in the Chesapeake. So he came down to Kinston with 120 Confederate Marines. They hauled their boats, their wooden boats down on the train from Richmond to Kinston. They rode 60 miles down the river from Kinston to New Bern, and on February 1st, they actually rowed down to what is Union Point looking for Union ships. They couldn't find any, so they rowed back up to roughly the islands across from where Hatteras is located. And the next day, the Union Army knew something was up, so they started positioning their naval vessels. There were only 3 naval vessels in New Bern at the time. There was an armed schooner that they put up in the Trent River. There was the USS Commodore Hall, which, as they were trying to position that in the Neuse River, it ran aground. And there was the USS Underwriter that they managed to get up to the riverbank in roughly across from where the Meet Muther lives in Riverside, or what was to become Riverside. On February 2nd, the night of February 2nd, the Confederate Marines rowed up to the USS Underwriter. They had 2 rows of these wooden boats, and this is the way that John Taylor Wood did this. They managed to get close enough to the Union gunboat before they sounded the alarm. They rowed like crazy to get up to the Union gunboat, boarded it, and had captured it within 15 minutes. Well, they had their prize, which the USS Underwriter was one of the largest gunboats in the Union Navy. It was the largest gunboat in North Carolina. But then the problem started. The boiler on this gunboat was not fired. So, you gotta fire the thing up and get the steam going before you can actually move the thing. They couldn't get it unshackled from the mooring. And Fort Stevenson, which this gunboat was right in front of Fort Stevenson, opened fire. A fort across the river at what is now Bridgeton opened fire on them. So the Confederate Marines were kind of stuck. And they thought, okay, we need to make a break for it. Let's set this thing on fire and take off. So they set it on fire, And as soon as the Union soldiers at Fort Stephenson saw what was happening, they all took off running. So the Confederate Marines were able to make their break. They rowed about half a mile up the river from this gunboat, and the entire thing, huge explosion. And they found out that this gunboat had several tons of black powder on it. That's why the Union soldiers took off running. They knew that. So you can download the story first-hand account of Surgeon Daniel Conrad, who was actually one of the Confederate Marines. He did a first-hand account, written account of the story in, I think, 1891. It was published in the Richmond newspaper. Great story. Here's an illustration of the Commodore Hall. And then here's Harper's Weekly illustration of the Commodore Hall actually in action at Plymouth, North Carolina. And the only thing I've found as far as a picture of the USS Underwriter is this Harper's Weekly illustration of the capture of the USS Underwriter. I've never seen this in any format other than digital. I've never seen a paper copy of this. I'd love to get a copy of this. But you can see that, you know, the illustration of the Confederate Marines rowing up to this boat. Here's the, you know, here is the gunboat. So it was a large gunboat for the Navy. All right, let's move forward a little bit more. This is 1868. This is Memorial Day in the National Cemetery. The New Bern National Cemetery was established in 1867. So this is the earliest picture that I have. This is standing in the National Cemetery, and you're looking down at what is now National Avenue. This is the old bridge. This is at the end of River Drive. And if you go out to the end of River Drive, this is Jack Smith Creek. If you go out to the end of River Drive when the water's low, you can still see the pilings of where the old bridge used to go across. But you can see that all of what is now Riverside is pretty much open fields in 1868. This is where Fort Stephenson was located. In fact, I've heard stories where some of the kids, even as late as the 1930s, the earthworks were still there and there was nothing up there except open space, and the kids would go up there and play in the earthworks. If we move a little further, this is 1884. Union soldier William Garrison Reed, 44th Massachusetts. He actually was part of the troops located in Riverside, or what became Riverside. He actually camped in this area. He took a couple pictures. This was the only structure in Riverside, and this was built after the Civil War. And then Mr. Reed also took this picture. This is the earthen fort works for Fort Dutton, just north of what is now the Mayola property where they park their trucks. This is the Neuse River. So this is roughly taken at North Craven Street in front of the Mayola, what is now the Mayola plant. Again, open fields. There's really nothing out there. Now, Mr. William Dunn is the one who established the Riverside area. He actually laid out the parcels of land in the late 1800s, and he at one time owned all this property. It was called Dunn's Fields. He was a truck farmer. He grew crops. He could grow crops 3 seasons a year. But think about it. This is the time when Florida really started to develop as far as a farming area. Florida could grow crops 4 seasons a year. So it was becoming less of an economic advantage to try to do truck farming on this property. And if you look at New Bern Sanborn insurance map from 1888, you can see even from the insurance standpoint, this is where the train station is. This is Queen Street. You can see that even the insurance map doesn't go any further than about where Union Station is located. If we move to 1908, now things are a little bit different. The train station is down here, This is where the train trestle now goes across the Neuse River. So right in here is what became the Riverside area. And lumber mills are starting to appear along the river. This is a page from the Sanborn map from 1908. So you've got New Bern Oil and Fertilizer that shows up. A little bit further down, you've got Roper Lumber. But I wanted to point out one thing on this that most people don't know about. I don't know if you can see this right here. This is where the railroad track goes across the Neuse River. Right here, just south of what is now North Craven Street. This says passenger station. Riverside had a passenger train station. This is a piece of it. This is the only piece that's left. This sits behind, as soon as you go across North Craven Street, the railroad tracks in North Craven Street across from Monk Mallard Park, this structure sits behind the house on the right. The Elks own this house. I was talking with Mr. Elks several years ago. He said that in the 1970s, the railroad tore down what was a freight depot. And he asked the railroad whether he could have a section of that freight depot, and they said, sure, if you haul it off. So he hauled it across the tracks, which was a short distance, and put it in his backyard, and he used it as a gathering place for his buddies in the evening. But this is most likely an original part of the passenger depot. The inside is really interesting. I mean, it's set up with a ticket office and laid out as a place where passengers would actually wait for the train. And this probably wasn't on the scale of a true passenger station. This was probably used as a waiting place for workers in the lumber mill and the railroad depot going back and forth across the river to Bridgeton. Here's another little interesting tidbit. Avenue A. Right now at the end of Avenue A is Don Miller Park, just a small park in honor of a police officer that was killed in New Bern. Well, this is from 1908. It's a guano factory with a big conveyor going out there. Now, if you'll think about it, back in the early 1900s, New Bern had a tremendous fishing industry, as well as most of eastern North Carolina. Well, the remains of all of these fish, that was a good source of making ammonia for fertilizer. So the barges would come in loaded with, basically fish guts and unload those to make fertilizer. Can you imagine what the smell would have been like in the summertime? Now, I'm not sure that this is the picture of that facility, but this is what it would look like. This is actually one of the two guano plants in New Bern at the time, and I'm not sure whether this is the one that was in Riverside or not. But you can see, a loading dock out here, a conveyor to get the stuff into the plant where they would mix it into fertilizer and make ammonia. Oaks Farm Implements. This is a little discovery. Oaks Farm Implements was located in the Riverside area very early on. This is from the Sanborn Insurance map in 1908. This is National Avenue, and I think it's North Street, North Drive would be about right here. This is located roughly where Boyd's Barber Shop is located, on that corner, kind of across from the Riverside Hardware. This is a picture of some of the buildings that were at the Oaks Farm Implements factory. I would love to see some of the implements, because you know that they somehow put Oaks Farm Implements on the equipment that they made, but I've never seen a piece of that equipment. This is a Sanborn Insurance map from 1913, and one of the things to note is that Avenue A was the first street that was developed in Riverside along with National Avenue. You can see Avenue A is pretty much developed Avenue B still has quite a few empty lots in it. And you probably heard about the brick streets in downtown New Bern. Well, Riverside also has brick streets. Most of North Craven Street from Queen Street up to at least Avenue A is brick pavers. Avenue A has brick pavers on it. North Pasteur from Dunn Street up to possibly Avenue B has brick pavers under it. I'm not sure about Avenue B. It's really interesting. You know, the infrastructure here on Avenue A, and probably as well as Avenue B, is from, you know, the early days of Riverside. And there's a lot, that infrastructure is over 100 years old, and they've done 5 repairs on Avenue A in the past month. And each time they come in here to repair a water line or a sewer line, they have to bring in some equipment, they have to cut out the bricks before they can even get the backhoe in there. Those brick streets are just incredible as far as their durability. I know that the Preservation Foundation is looking at an initiative on how to restore some of these old brick streets in New Bern. I'm hoping that we could do something with at least some of the sections in Riverside. Here's another little gem. I don't know if you can see it or not. This is, again, from Sanborn map in 1913, right here. This is Avenue B, Avenue A. This is where the Riverside School sits right now. And I don't know if you can see it or not, but it says Riverside Episcopal Church. So there was an Episcopal church in Riverside on North Pasteur and Avenue B. This Episcopal church, I don't have any pictures of this. I'd love to have a picture of this. But my understanding is that the congregation of this church eventually joined what became the Riverside Methodist Church, which does exist down here on Avenue B. Here's another Sanborn map from 1913, and this is along the river. You can see that now we're starting to get a whole lot of industrial development along the river. We've got a cannery, we've got fertilizer plant, we've got several lumber mills, we've got a company that makes wooden boxes, we've got Oaks Farm Implements. So this is really the industrial heart, has become the industrial heart of New Bern. And this is where a lot of the people in Riverside worked. This Riverside was, for the most part, a blue-collar community. And this whole thing about suburbs, what is a suburb? You know, back in the late 1800s, this is a whole new concept. And William Dunn really took a gamble here as far as trying to set up New Bern's first suburb, which is Riverside. He plotted out the land. He had to get people interested in buying the lots. And what I find interesting with the way that Riverside is set up is that you've got a mix of, you know, your affluent people who built the big houses right beside rental houses where the mill workers and the people who worked at the depot lived. So it's really quite a mix. The other thing that's interesting about this, if you walk in downtown New Bern, you'll see a house that was built in the 1700s or early 1800s, and right beside that is another house that was built in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Well, if you think about it, when New Bern was developed, downtown New Bern has 250 years of architectural history. And there was no running water, there was no sewer when New Bern was developed. Water and sewer showed up in downtown New Bern in 1892. So you had these big lots, you had these houses where you had to have the outhouse and the well separated so that, you know, you had fresh water. Well, when New Bern got running water and sewer, people were able to take these big lots and subdivide those and sell those lots off. And you've got just an incredible mixture of different architecture in downtown New Bern. Riverside was built with the latest technology. You had running water and sewer from the get-go. You had small lots to start with, and all the architecture in New Bern goes from the late 1800s up through the 1920s. And what's interesting is if you start at Avenue A at North Craven Street and you walk up Avenue A, it looks a lot like downtown New Bern. Same architectural style. You've got the shotgun side halls. And then when you turn up National Avenue and start heading north, you can see the early houses. And as you go up National Avenue, the architectural style starts to change. You start to see architectural styles from the 19-teens, from 1920s, 1930s. So it's really interesting to see that transition as far as how Riverside was developed. This is another sandboard map. This is Roper Lumber Mill number 2, 1913. Huge lumber mill. The Roper Lumber Mill was the largest lumber mill in North Carolina, one of the largest in the Southeast. At one time, and when this mill was in its heyday, it was running 24 hours a day, doing 100 million board feet of lumber a year. A couple pictures of that. This is from a postcard in 1911. This is now the Riverside area. This would be National Avenue, North Craven Street along here. But you can see what the Roper Lumber Mill looked like. Here's an interesting shot that I found. Again, the Roper Lumber Mill in the background. This is a football game. I don't know whether this is the New Bern High School football team playing. But you can see there's quite a crowd here watching the football game. Here is the lumber mill. It had become Bait Lumber Mill and by the 1950s. And this is actually more down towards Queen Street. And I put this in here just because I found it interesting. This right in here would be where Union Station is located. This is the train depot. And if you look closely, right here is the old roundhouse that existed at the depot. The New Bern Train Depot was a fairly large facility at the time. The railroad was built through New Bern in 1859, and of course, steam locomotives were replaced by diesel probably in late 30s, early 40s. But even this facility, this roundhouse where they brought in the steam engines to work on them, that existed up through the 1950s. It's a shame that's gone. As far as what's left of this huge, of this huge Roper Lumber Mill, this is on the Mayola property. These are the only 2 buildings that are left. It would be nice if these buildings did not get torn down in the future. The last lumber mill that was here closed in, I think, 1994. And this whole area along the river has been cleared and it's open for development. But this is standing on the railroad trestle that goes across the Neuse River. It's on North Craven Street. So you can see, standing on the railroad trestle, this is what's left. This is a day when the water was really low back in 2009. This is Queens Point right here. This is the little pagoda that was out at the end of that dock. And you can see that, from Queens Point all the way up to that railroad trestle in Riverside, nothing but warehouses and wharves. If you're a boater and you've ever been up this way, do not get out of the channel. I mean, you can see even pretty far out there is an old piling that's sticking up in the water. This is on the north side of Avenue A, looking up the river. And again, the entire river was lined with warehouses at one time. Just a huge, huge lumber mill in that area. And here's another interesting shot. I've always been fascinated with this picture. Again, this is when the water was really low, and this is, let's see, the Mayola property is up here, so this is a little north of the Mayola property. The river usually covers this entire area, but this day, the water was way out, and it looks like there's just a huge basket weave pattern on the floor of the river. And I could never figure out what this was, and someone who was familiar with the lumber mills said that all the warehouses in this area is where they would stack the lumber that would be put on barges for shipping out of New Bern. And he said that all these strips that looks like a basket weave pattern on the bottom of the river, he said those were strips that they put between the lumber so that there would be some airflow around them. And he said, you know, when the warehouses were demolished, when they burned, whatever, they just pushed whatever was left into the river. So, I mean, this is still in the bottom of the river. It's been covered up for who knows how many years with water. This is just north of the Mayola property. Here is the Mayola property where they park their trucks. And this is, I don't know if this would have been a bulkhead at Fort Dutton, the Union fort that was on the Neuse River, but this is roughly where that fort would have been located. And this is concrete, and the stones in the concrete are the round pebbles like you would find up north from, you know, from the glaciation and a lot of the rocks that you get up there along the coast in New England are, you know, the round, smooth pebbles. And that's what is in this concrete. So that, you know, I don't know whether this is something that the Union Army poured as far as a bulkhead for their fort, but intriguing as far as what that is. Another little piece of information on Riverside. Riverside had a fire department. This is Cypress Street, and the street has changed a little bit over the years because Cypress Street now goes straight across here. This is where Cedar Grove Cemetery is located, the northern corner of Cedar Grove Cemetery. And if you'll notice right here, it says Fire Department, and then in smaller letters it says Riverside Fire Station. So Riverside actually had a fire station. And this is George Street that turns into National Avenue up here. Here's a picture of the one fire wagon that they had. And if you'll notice right here, it says Riverside. This fire department existed from about 1908 through sometime after 1913. And I showed this picture to Janet Latham. And Janet said, oh, that was taken in front of the William Dunn House on National Avenue. And I said, well, how do you know? And she said, well, I used to be able to sit on the front porch where we lived in National Avenue and look up the street and see Miss Dunn's greenhouse. Now, there's also, I have a picture of it, but the Dunn house behind the Dunn house is a carriage house. It's one of the few carriage houses left in Riverside, much less New Bern. And I can't remember who told me, but someone told me that, you know, William Dunn's house, he developed Riverside, he built a house there, is that his carriage house at one time was used as the fire station. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it makes sense. I mean, here's the fire engine in front of William Dunn's house.
The side of the William Dunn house, that piece that looks like a porch railing up there near the horse's head,
Yeah.
that is facing river. I mean, that is the side, and it's porch. It's part
Yeah.
of the front porch facing National Avenue. This faces Avenue C.
C, yes. So this would be National Avenue on this side, Avenue B down here, and then I've got a picture of the carriage house, which is back here. We'll get to that in a minute. Now something else that's shows up in Riverside by 1924 is what everyone has called the tobacco factory. So the facility ran from the Neuse River. Here's where the railroad trestle goes across the Neuse River. This is Dunn Street, so that facility ran from the Neuse River all the way across to National Avenue. This building burned. It's the brick building we call the S.B. Parker building now. That sits as soon as you come across the railroad tracks, onto National Avenue. There's a big brick building, S.B. Parker building. This building that's on this map actually burned in the 1930s. S.B. Parker built another building. I've got a picture of, there was another building that was built here as part of the tobacco factory, actually, yes, it was built as part of the tobacco factory right here. I've got a picture from Hurricane Ione in 1955 that has just a corner of that building on it. But I'd like some pictures of the tobacco factory if anyone has them. There was boat building going on in Riverside. I don't have the full story on this, but this was, Mayola actually owns the property where this was located. The, I believe it's the Historical Society, or is it Swiss Bear? I forget which. Swiss Bear disassembled this piece of equipment. This is from the Barber Boat Works that was in the Riverside area. Supposedly this was some equipment that they built for building boats in World War I. Anything more than that, I don't know, other than there was a Barber Boat Works facility in New Bern. And this was what they used to haul the boats in and out of the water. Of course, we've got Mayola Milk and Ice Cream. Mayola came to New Bern in 1937. It was originally the owner, Mr. Mayo. He actually started he owned a Coca-Cola bottling plant in Washington, North Carolina, and he decided to get into the dairy business. So he bought this property, and they were trying to come up with a name for the dairy, and he had a contest with employees, and they came up with Mayola. May coming from his name, Mayo, and Ola coming from Coca-Cola, since he owned the Coca-Cola bottling plant. This was actually, I don't think the building exists anymore, but there was actually an ice house right here. This is the corner of Avenue C and North Craven. And I can remember I started coming to New Bern in 1986. And I can remember riding from downtown to Mayola, and there was the Mayola ice cream shop right here. It had that wonderful smell of an ice cream shop. It closed, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s. There was some talk a few years ago about opening that up again, but it never happened. And there's an interesting mural hanging in the one of the Mayola meeting rooms. Sort of outlines the history of Mayola and the founders and so forth. That would be a nice piece of history there to hold on to, that mural. Sadler Stores. The Sadlers had quite a few stores in New Bern, particularly in the Riverside area. Greg Ellerson, who was married to Eloise Mosby, dropped this picture off at my house. I had no idea what it was. And looking through some information from the Department of Interior's National Registry information on Riverside, I finally figured out what this was. This is on North Craven Street. Here are the railroad tracks that go across the river, the railroad trestle. This is, right here is where Mike Manette's florist shop sits. You might know it as the Sunshine Center. This house is now a Phoenix halfway house. This building still exists. This is where the Sadlers lived. The Sadlers built this house, I believe, in 1906. Here is one of the original Sadler stores. This property was sold in the 1920s, and whoever bought this property closed the store and re-engineered this house, or this structure. This now looks like a house. It's a two-story house, and it's never exactly looked right to me. There's just been something weird about it, and this is why. It used to be a store. It's been re-engineered to a house. And this is the Sadler store on North Craven Street. This is where Mamie Sadler ran her grocery store. I'd love to have some pictures of Mamie Sadler and a little bit more history on her. I know there are people out there that knew Mamie Sadler. She was quite an individual, and she started this store in 1918. She was, I mean, if you think about it, in 1918, women didn't have the right to vote yet. And it was quite interesting. You got a female who is running a business, and supposedly Mamie Sadler is one of the first women in New Bern who got a driver's license. This building still exists. It's not in very good shape. The Sadlers lived on the second floor. The first floor was the grocery store. And people have told me this is one of the finest grocery stores in New Bern. They had the best meats, best produce.
What was the location of the first one?
This is just before you get to the railroad tracks on North Craven Street, coming into Riverside. Now this building, the Preservation Foundation owns this building, and it opened up this building so people could come in and stand and look in there. It was interesting talking with some of the folks who showed up at this building. The Small brothers, who now live in Bridgeton, they live just down the street from the Sadler store, and they walked in there and they said, oh yeah, here's where this counter was, here's where this counter was, and I mean they knew the entire interior of the store and what was in there. The store, the walls are still lined with shelves where the produce was. And the Small brothers told me an interesting story here. They said that they were about 5 years old when their sister was born. And they can remember when their sister was just a little baby that they used to go down to Sadler's store with their mother, and Miss Mamie would take the baby and put the baby on the meat scales and weigh the baby to make sure it was gaining weight. National Avenue. National Avenue was the first paved street in New Bern. It was called the macadamized road very early on. You know, this whole thing with pavement was new. These pictures are probably from early 1900s. This is looking north on National Avenue. This is also looking north on National Avenue. You can see that these huge oak trees along National Avenue were fairly small at the time. Here's another view of National Avenue. This is looking north. This is the William Dunn House. So this was taken, William Dunn House was built, I believe, in 1913. So this was 1913, 1915, somewhere in there. This is National Avenue looking south. And I have no idea what these buildings are. There was a New Bern Military Academy at one time along National Avenue, George Street. I don't know whether this is part of the fairgrounds or not, but just interesting to see what National Avenue looked like in very early days. As far as the historic district, Riverside is a locally designated historic district, just like downtown. We have to follow the historic guidelines of New Bern, and this outlines the historic district. We pretty much go from Dunn Street all the way up to North Avenue, so it's roughly 11 blocks. There are 175 historic structures in Riverside, so it's almost complete in the sense that, it was all built in a 30 to 40 year span. These structures are still here. Just a little bit, very quickly, on some of the houses. This is the oldest house in Riverside. This is the Guyon House. When you head up George Street, cross the railroad tracks, it becomes National Avenue. This house sits on the left. Interesting with the mansard roof, kind of an empire style, very unique. Here is the Dewey Aberley House. Mr. Aberley was the president of Pine Lumber Company, and later on Harvey Barnes, who was one of the owners of Mayola, lived in this house. This was built in 1895, so this is one of the oldest houses in New Bern. John Aberley House, built in 1922. We have some really interesting bungalow-style, craftsman bungalows in Riverside. Supposedly, Commander Cushman, who helped develop, who came down to New Bern to help develop Cherry Point Marine Air Station, he stayed in this house in 1941. Of course, Congressman Graham Barden lived just down the street, so I guess Congressman Barden figured he could keep an eye on him and push him to, to get Cherry Point moving. Here is where Congressman Graham Barden lived. Congressman Graham Barden, he was in Congress from about 1930 through early 60s. He was instrumental in getting the military bases in eastern North Carolina. I find it interesting that here's his house, but where is the historic marker? It's on Broad Street. Go figure. This is the Latham house. Dr. Joseph and Marjorie Latham lived here. Pictures of the doctor and Marjorie. This is the interesting picture. It's from the Mayola newsletter, probably from the 1950s. She's standing in front of her house with Santa Claus, and Santa Claus is delivering some Mayola eggnog. The Kafer House on National Avenue. It was built by Oscar Kafer. He was chairman of the Craven County Commissioners in the late 20s, and it was the home of Ella Bingle, the only female mayor that we've had in New Bern so far. And of course, her daughter-in-law is running for mayor this year. Turnbull House. This is one of the two houses in Riverside that were designed by Herbert Woodley Simpson, famous architect here in New Bern. This is further up National Avenue. Mr. Turnbull was the president of Roland Lumber Company, one of the big lumber mills along the river. Very interesting house. And according to what Janet Latham told me is that when Mr. Turnbull had this house built, he made them run a steam pipe from the mill to his house so that he would have steam heat. Can't verify that, but Janet swears that. This is the William Dunn House. I think this is one of the great houses in Riverside, if not in New Bern. This was built in 1913 by William Dunn, who originally laid out the Riverside neighborhood. When this was built, this had the best of everything in it. It's just a fantastic house. I've never been in this house. I've seen pictures of this house. If there was another house that I would consider owning in Riverside, this would be it. Just a fantastic house. This is the carriage house in the back of Mr. Dunn's house. Remember I mentioned a few minutes ago that rumor is that the Riverside Fire Department may have been located in this carriage house at one time. D.M. Parker House. Mr. Parker was the vice president of S.B. Parker. S.B. Parker is the oldest continuous business in New Bern. This sits on National Avenue, a great craftsman-style house. Whitehurst Ward House. This sits on Avenue D. Let's see, I forget. Help me out here, Teresa. What did Mr. Whitehurst do, Mr. Ward? They were related. Yeah, Whitehurst built it. Charles Ward, who bought the house in 1920, was the chief clerk at Roper Lumber Company. So kind of your I guess you'd say a Midwest style house. This is the Baker House. This is built in 1897. Now, it's not in the best of shape right now, but this is such a unique house architecturally for when it was built. I've said I would never buy another house and restore it, but I would consider buying this one and restoring it. I know someone who has been in this house recently. The gentleman who lives here is getting on up in his years, and he just can't really do much more restoration work on it. But what I've been told is the house is completely intact on the inside. All the trim, all the doors, all the hardware. This could be such a show place. Riverside Methodist Church, built in 1920. This is on Avenue A. This is a very unique church. The seating in the church is sort of in a semicircle. If you've ever been in Centenary Methodist Church downtown, as far as the seating is concerned, somewhat like that. Riverside School. I've talked with a few people here who actually went to Riverside School. Built in 1922, kind of an Italianate style. Seventh-day Adventist Church currently owns it. This building is for sale. We have 2 cemeteries in Riverside. There is the Jewish Cemetery, established in 1877. Right beside it is the National Cemetery. And this is a shot, a recent shot of the cemetery. This is from the 1900s. And what I find interesting is back in the 1900s, the National Cemetery was really quite wooded, quite park-like. But, you know, like many of the national cemeteries, you know, there's not much space left, so the trees disappeared over the years. And just, you know, I could go on and on with the houses in Riverside. Here are just some other shots of some of the cool houses that are in Riverside. You know, I could talk for another hour on these houses because it's just such interesting architecture, such interesting houses, and people who lived in these houses in Riverside. So now we're down to the point where I'm going to beg for pictures and stories. I know we have some folks here. I've got some names of folks who have some connections with Riverside. I'm looking for pictures and stories on the lumber mills. I certainly want to talk with this gentleman here. You know, the fertilizer plant, Mayola. I'd love to have some pictures of the Union Earthworks. Riverside Beach used to be in Riverside. It was all the way up at Jack Smith Creek. I was told that you know, there was a changing facility there. It was maintained by the city of New Bern. The city of New Bern used to provide swimming lessons up there for kids. I know a couple people who have furniture from the Epting Woodwork Shop. This was located on National Avenue. This gentleman was supposedly quite the craftsman and could build some outstanding furniture. Here's my name and number. I also have a pad up here if you would like to give me some contact information. I have a scanner that I can bring to your house and scan pictures. The pictures never have to leave your hands, and I would collect the stories at the same time. All right. That's the best I can do in 45 minutes. I would like to recognize a few other folks here. You know, we've worked really hard to try to bring Riverside back. And I'd like to recognize a few folks who have really been instrumental in doing this. Dallas Blackiston. Dallas, stand up. Dallas owns about 10 houses in Riverside. He buys the houses, he restores them, and I mean these are nice houses that he has fixed. He's not buying them and flipping them. So he's really done a lot to kickstart this. Marjorie Price. Marjorie, stand up, Marjorie. Marjorie and her husband David owned the Guyon House, the oldest house in Riverside. They were instrumental in getting the Riverside Association as well as getting Riverside as a locally designated historic district. Teresa Resti and her daughter Sarah. They own the Whitehurst Ward House on Avenue D. They were one of the early urban pioneers in Riverside, been very active in pushing folks forward and trying to develop that neighborhood. And last but not least, Janet Latham. Janet lives in the house that her parents built. The Dr. Latham and Marjorie Latham on National Avenue. Janet is a wealth of knowledge and stories on Riverside. You sit down with her, you're going to be sitting with her for several hours. She's just full of stories. But these are the people who have brought Riverside back. You know, help us as much as you can. It's important that we maintain Riverside. It is truly a historic gem here in New Bern. All right, thank you so much for your attention.